for you, Tony? You got a frown. Okay. So Professor Tootle, a point of personal privilege, because my mom keeps telling us for months that she wasn't going to make it to 90, but her 90th birthday is on Monday. So I think she's going to make it. And so last week, or about 9 days ago, I told you that I was just sitting around late at night with my mom talking about extremism in America because of our show coming up a week ago Friday. And I said, Mom, can you outline what you think is extremism in America? And she came up with a top 8 list. And then we added 2 more brainstorming about it. But here is, in order, the best examples of extremism in America. And please don't contradict my mom, but we're going to talk about some of this today. In order, her number 1 instinctual answer was the KKK. Thought that was interesting. That's extremism in America, KKK. Number 2 was the revolution and the founding of our country. We talked about that last week, so we may not talk about it as much. Number 3 and number 4 tied together, QAnon / Trump cult. Now, not Trump voters, the Trump cult, people that just seem to be so intertwined with the personality that they can't separate anything else. That was 3 and 4. Number 5, Proud Boys. And that's from her watching CNN and that kind of stuff. I get it. Number 6 is Southern Rebels. And that's such an interesting term for my mom, who was born in Indiana and now has lived in Colorado for 50, 60 years. Number 7 was anti-Semitic folks, which I think was really interesting. Followed directly, without even a pause, by anti-Muslim folks as number 8. Then abortion extremist. She's pretty solidly pro-choice. I think you're pretty solidly pro-life. I don't think either of you would refer to each other as extremists, but I think that was interesting that she brought up abortion extremists as something dangerous to America. And then finally, but not guns, the gun problem, gun violence. Who's willing to take innocent lives? What's going on with that? And she did mean a little bit of the extremists, anti-gun and pro-gun, people that are just so off the edge of loving or hating guns. We're not going to talk about my mom's thing because you're a historian, but it does give context. Let me give you one more piece of context. When I was in the Army, I had a secret clearance. And so there's certain things that you're not allowed to do in the military. Visit extremist websites, for example. Now, when I was in the military, I don't think there were websites, but there was extremist things that you could do. You could go to an event. I also did top secret clearances for others. And I think part of that top secret clearance is you're not able to talk about doing top secret clearances. And I hope I didn't just blow it by saying I've done some of that for people. And you're not able to ask the questions and who are they about, that kind of thing. But in general terms, I hope I don't get put in Leavenworth for this. In general, are they a part of any extremist organization? Do they have extremist thoughts? Are they willing to harm America? Do they not believe in our republic? Do they believe in violence for political means? Those kind of questions, as well as personal questions of drinking and drugs and things that could make them vulnerable to bribery or whatever, or stuff. And so the purpose of this show, the second show in a row, which is the first time we've done it, is to both help individuals live a good and healthy life as American citizens, and the good of America. How do we reach our highest calling? And what's our role in dealing with extremists in our history and currently? And I have a question for you, Professor, after your bio. How do you even know if you're extreme? Maybe some of my views are extreme and I just don't know it. Or maybe some of the organizations I belong to are extreme. I'm kind of a libertarian, Republican, conservative. Maybe a lot of liberals think that's extreme. And so if you'll ponder that, and I'll ask my first question or two after you give your introduction. Professor Tootle, thanks for doing the second show on extremism. First your bio and then give a reaction to my overview.
I'm Stephen Tootle. I'm a professor of history at the College of Sequoias. I also teach at Ashland University, and my PhD is in American political history from the great Ohio University, where I studied under Alonzo Hamby. And I was just thinking about Hamby today, so I want to mention him again today. And in many ways, probably the most important intellectual influence on me was Hamby. So I sometimes feel like I need to remind people of my kind of coaching tree there. And what was your first question?
just a reaction to my mom's or my concern about individual Americans being extremists as well as America. Are we going off the deep end, or are we okay?
Yeah, I guess I think a good starting point for me is to remind, I don't know, the world, the internet, YouTube, Facebook, of my definition of extremism, which is anyone who's outside of the American political tradition. So the Declaration of Independence was something that summarized what all Americans believe, and it listed rights that all Americans have, and anyone who is arguing for a peaceful balancing of those rights is not an extremist, and anyone who wants to get rid of any of them is an extremist, and anyone who advocates in the use of violence in attacking any of those pluralistic values is an extremist. So one of the things that people find confusing is that I would say if you're an American conservative or an American liberal, you are not an extremist. But if you are on the left or if you are on the right, then you are an extremist.
And I know you don't like the terms left and right, so why don't you define those terms, since you just said they are both extremists? So define them for us.
If you're in the American political context, if you're someone who is on the right, you are someone who wants either a return to monarchy, or you believe in some sort of totalitarian ideal. And both the left and the right are based on totalitarianism. And if you are rejecting pluralism and embracing some form of totalitarianism, you are an extremist. So, and that it doesn't really matter to me if your form of totalitarianism is fascist nationalism or the abolition of private property. If you are somebody who embraces what is sometimes called monism, singleism, you are rejecting pluralism. You have some version of utopia that claims that perfection is possible on Earth if only we would reconcile all of society according to a single ideal, right? And that single ideal can be a king, or it can be nationalism, or it can be racism, or it can be the abolition of private property. But if you have a single ideal that you believe that following this single ideal will lead to heaven on earth, then you are an extremist. And if you are somebody who advocates in the use of violence in trying to attain that, then you're a violent extremist. So my definition of extremism is anything that's outside the American political tradition.
Excellent. So, Professor, some friends watched this in absentia, the replay on YouTube or maybe Facebook Live, and they had some concerns. And it was about what you're talking about. They went, "Oh, wait, there's not one comment I remember, not exactly verbatim, but that said, there isn't a politician in America today advocating the elimination of private property rights. What's that professor talking about?" And that was an interesting interpretation of what you said. But why don't you just, instead of us guessing what you might have said, why don't you talk about, if you're an extremist advocating against the American system, property rights as an example, what's your reaction to that? And I don't think that's violent extremism. I think they're using the democratic processes to take private property rights.
Well, as I said, if I can't catalog everything that's ever been said by every living American politician, so I can't weigh in on whether or not there is currently an American politician who
is there any, though? I don't mean to put you on the spot. I mean, but are there any? Is AOC or any of the, whatever they're called, what are they called? Those four folks?
That's an interesting case, because you almost have to have a more coherent set of beliefs in order to be categorized as an extremist, or in other words, if you mention somebody like AOC, I've never really detected a coherent or consistent ideology. So, I don't know if she has ever kind of said the magic words, which would be like, I believe in the use of violence to destroy the very idea of private property in America, or something along those lines. But so I don't know about.
So one of my friends, I don't know if you met him when you came to Colorado last time. Eric, and I don't even want to use his last name because it's the internet. But Eric was going to review this tape, and he's going to compare what you said last Friday to this Friday, and like drill into you as almost like a lawyer would. And you don't never need to defend yourself, but I do want to have you have a chance to advocate your belief system and what we should be thinking about as Americans. So when you said what you said last Friday, that it's not violent extremism, but there are people advocating against the very notion of America, and that's extreme. What do you mean by that?
Well, I guess I've been influenced by this recent metaphor, and I think it's appropriate that some forms of extremism, are a cancer and some are a heart attack, meaning that there are some people who want to use violence in order to enact an extremist agenda right now, and that's like a heart attack that kills you now. And then
is that like an example of that? Would that be January 6th? Because we didn't talk about the right side, and I know we don't like right and left, but we didn't talk about that at all last week.
But it's not that I don't like the terms right and left. I just want them applied to the right people. Like when people who say I reject pluralism and I believe that, that I forget what the QAnon conspiracy, how it works exactly, but that the enactment of the QAnon conspiracy will bring about heaven on earth, then let's call these people on the right. When William Dudley Pelley was a fascist, he was on the right.
Who is William Dudley Pelley?
Oh, he was just an American fascist in the 1930s. They've been out there. They're out there. So I don't. And I think what's more common now, and I guess the sort of parallel to your democratic socialist that exists on the right now, are these people who are arguing for some version of what's the term, Catholic integralism, where these people are rejecting the separation of church and state, and want essentially a Catholicism integrated with the American government.
Is that the current criticism of a couple Supreme Court justices?
No.
Talk to me. I'm not following you then.
Oh, I guess it's some of the guys who write for the Claremont Review of Books now. There was an essay published. A lot of the intellectual defenders of Trump make this case that that you need someone like Trump to sort of bring order to the force, and that the system is so broken now that you need to embrace the right in order to counter the left.
Right. Okay.
Michael Anton wrote this essay called "The Flight 93 Election" that was kind of, if you read the blog American Greatness, a lot of the people who write for American Greatness make this kind of argument that basically it's an anti-liberalism argument. And if you want another, another classic example of this you can find on the internet was the argument about anti-Frenchism, the attacks on David French, who's somebody who kind of defends the classical liberal tradition. And there are these people on the right who are critical of David French and call I mean, I was just gonna say like, wow, David French, you now get credit for classical liberalism. Like, but David French wasn't coming up with these ideas. He was just defending, basic American pluralism. But
Right.
there are people like that out there who just are infuriated by David French. So I would just say that if you're somebody who's infuriated by David French and because of his critique of Donald Trump, you are somebody who is on the right and you are advocating something that is extremism. And depending
but
on
those same folks would have the same critique of your speeches and philosophy, correct?
oh yeah, they hate me too.
Yeah.
Right?
But there's also folks on the left that probably disdain your views as well, correct?
Yep, they hate me too. Yep.
Which is your point about classical liberalism.
Right. I mean, if you describe the values of classical liberalism, it's just sort of basic 101 Americanism as it was understood by most Americans for most of American history. The Declaration of Independence is not meant to be controversial, right? But I would just say, if you are someone who rejects the Declaration of Independence, you're an extremist. And
okay, let's drill as if last week wasn't controversial enough. Let's drill into that just slightly. I have a ton of friends, and they are good friends. I mean, they're neighbors, probably family members. I'm trying to think through family members, neighbors, colleagues, people I've known for 30 years. That reject that statement right there. They believe that America was founded, and I'm not talking about critical race theory, but kind of the themes of critical race theory or anti-critical race theory that are used for political purposes, that they think America was found is evil and was a pretty nasty place, and we should maybe not be embarrassed about it because it was the times, but it was a bad country, and we should fix that. And you're saying, are you not, that if you say those kind of statements against the founding of our country, you're an extremist?
Yeah, I mean, it's like if they make those kinds of statements, they would love the Dred Scott decision.
Well, now that's the flip side of the same coin. So explain.
No, it's not though. The underlying theory behind the Dred Scott decision is that America is and has always been a racist country, and that therefore we need to enact a government on the basis of race. And I would just say the outrage that was provoked by the Dred Scott decision among the vast majority of Americans indicates that even when the Dred Scott decision was issued, most Americans found it to be abhorrent and contrary to everything that they believed. They founded a party and elected a president in really short order.
Had a civil war over it.
And fought a civil war over it pretty quickly. So, I would say we have a pretty good track record of defending the Declaration of Independence as written. And I mean, Abraham Lincoln, in his speech about the Dred Scott decision, it's funny because he used that sort of like frontier language that somehow makes it more powerful. But he said, "This they said, and this meant." He took out the second they, but the Declaration of Independence is not meant to be interpreted. It is meant to be accepted. It is the maxim. It is the definition of an American. Like, this they said, and if I correct his grammar, and this they meant. Like, it was meant to be
self-evident.
The standard maxim, the definition of an American.
Okay. Last week, on that similar theme, you described what I thought was maybe in priority order, but it's not, because we talked privately for a minute or two before the show started. Examples of extremism that I thought may be in priority order, and you just clarified to me privately that it was in chronological order. Do you mind kind of just fleshing that out a little bit more, and then consider adding in some other things that we should be concerned about as citizens now, that we should go back through history to figure out the right course of action?
Well, I mean, I was just going through the threats to the American system as they appeared, and
I thought it was really powerful. I hope people listen to that segment. But do you mind kind of, after a week's reflection?
I mean, the first threat to classical liberalism, or the American system, or American pluralism, was the British monarchy. And then it was too much democracy under the Articles of Confederation. Then it was slavery. Then it was the defenders of slavery. Then it was the people who refused to enact or follow the federal laws to protect civil rights after the Civil War. And then I said the progressives, and I guess that was the part that made everybody mad. Then the various fascist movements, minor though they may be. Then the white supremacist blending of racism post-World War II. And then I guess the resurgence of the new left in the late 60s to mid 70s. And then I would also throw in the anti-American right that began rising with the Brown decision and sort of was fully formed by the 1970s. And then the attacks on the various attacks on truth that took place in the 70s and 80s, kind of postmodernism and that kind of stuff. And then each of these, and then going into the sort of like anyone who has a racial, I mean, the media environment is really becoming fragmented in the 1990s. So in a way, what you're getting is more extremism, but also smaller groups of people amplifying their voices. So by the late 1990s, you would have to list 300 different groups of wackadoos with their various theories. I mean, I remember every now and then, if I really wanted to depress myself, you could go on the like Craigslist discussion forums, and you would see people who dedicated, hundreds of hours to arguing with other conspiracy theorists on the internet. I haven't done it in probably 20 years. I don't know.
Good. You might need a security clearance.
Yeah, I don't know if even that still exists. But you see this stuff on Twitter, you see it on Facebook, you see it on various forms of social media today. But I guess I would just put all those groups of people into one giant pile of people who have some sort of theory that makes sense to themselves, but that would culminate in the destruction of the United States.
Yeah. So, Professor, boy, you just spoke about a lot there. So, friends who joined us, feel free to ask questions about any of what he just talked about in about 3 minutes or maybe 5 minutes. So, Professor, extremism isn't unusual. When I first ran for county commissioner back in 1990, when I was in the Army, I enlisted in the Army in 91, then I ran for county commissioner in 96. My co-precinct leader, I was a Republican, and my co-precinct leader, two of us in our neighborhood where I'm born and raised, was kind enough to tell me directly to my face that I was going to be the first person he would assassinate, because he thought I was part of the Rothschilds, or how could this young Army officer who then be elected as a county commissioner, I must be controlled by somebody, some powerful worldwide interest. Oh, well, thanks, neighbor. So extremists have been around a long time. But also extremists are real today. This is true. I'm not going to name them for obvious reasons, but I have 10 or 15 or 20 people that are QAnon followers. They're still Facebook friends today, so they may see this video at some point. They were truly telling me that the election's not going to hold last November, a year ago, November. Just wait until January. Watch, John. You think you understand government and history and tradition and our legal system. You don't. Watch. And I mean, we're literally talking back and forth with each other. They truly, in their hearts, still to this day, I think, believe that Trump is still president and the whole system's corrupt and blah, blah, blah. So anyway, how do we help those people? And how do we help America? What's the most extreme right now?
Well, I used to comfort myself sometimes in the early days when I would think about extremism by telling myself that, like, pretty consistently, about 10% of Americans or more believe that the moon landing is fake. And when you start doing the math on that, you realize that means we got between 36 and 40 million Americans who every single day get up and go about their lives and manage to make it through the day believing something that's just wacky. I don't know where you find that comforting or horrifying, but that's a lot of people, right? I mean, 35 to 40 million people is a lot. And so, and I was just telling one of my classes that the number of Americans who believe in the Kennedy assassination being a conspiracy is just astronomical. I haven't looked at it lately, but last time I checked, it was higher than I think it has ever been. And then I contrast that with how many historians who have done serious research into the Kennedy administration, like that is to say, historians with real academic credentials that are specialists in the field who have looked at the Kennedy assassination. If you've got over half of Americans, 60 or 70% of Americans believing that there was a conspiracy to kill Kennedy and Oswald.
Oh, it's that high. It's over the majority of Americans.
I mean, somebody should Google this while we're looking. Jason Nelson, can you Google this or somebody? Because I haven't looked in years, but it's pretty high. But if you look at the number of historians using regular history techniques, the percentage of historians is 0. There's not a single historian who has ever looked at the Kennedy assassination and found anything other than Oswald acting alone. Because historians are people who are supposed to look at facts and then say what the facts mean, we don't track down rumors. The conspiracy theories all start with the "isn't it possible that," and that's not really the rules of evidence that we're supposed to follow. As far as I know, there are no historians who believe anything other than Oswald acted alone. No real ones. I mean, who knows? Somebody might have a PhD in theology from some online school and claims to be a historian, but I mean, no real one anyway. So anyway, but I don't know if that's comforting or horrifying.
Yeah, both. So, Professor, we talked a lot about slavery and the ramifications of slavery as being extremism. Last week and again this week, we've just only touched on the extremism on the right. Do you want to touch on that more? I mean, should we be concerned about this, or do you think it's such a small element? Is it 5% of society or 30% of society that's off the deep end?
I guess I'm going to reject the premise of your question and say that I'm talking about all these people as if they are the same, because they are to me.
Left or right, it doesn't matter.
You're right. They're to me, they are un-American, unpatriotic. They all belong in the same bucket, which is so I guess I don't know how many minutes that we have discussed the various groups,
right.
But
well, okay, let me personalize it then, Professor, and you may not take my bait. Is Speaker Pelosi an extremist?
No.
How about I forget his real title, but representative, but he has a better title, higher title, McCarthy?
No.
Okay, so why do all our friends on the left and the right, well, not even left and the right, just conservative and liberals, call them both extremists? What's going on in America? Why are we in this state?
Well, for one thing, sometimes we get angry. People are capable of, letting emotions run wild. And then we've had this conversation in other contexts, but, human beings, the same human being who's capable of love and kindness and affection is also capable of violence and hatred and irrationality. And so asking me the same question when I'm angry versus when I'm not angry, you might get a different answer, So of course our friends say wacky things, friends say wacky things.
Okay, fair enough. I know we didn't satisfy some of my friends to their satisfaction because we're going to see their comments. So that's why I'm going to consider a third show on this. It may not be next week. We'll see. But I do want to give an opportunity for particularly Bill. But Frank, I know you missed part of the conversation, but maybe you have some questions on what you've heard so far. Bill, you said you were going to be patient while you think about it. Have you thought about it, Bill? What's your question?
I have thought about it, and so Professor Tootle, I think I could be helped in following your tremendous insights on this with a couple of things. A keystone of sorts for me is your working definition of democratic socialism and progressivism. And I don't want to debate your definition. I just want to know what your working definition is, because that will help me understand the totality of your perspective, and it would help me a great deal.
Okay, there is a long and proud tradition in American politics within American liberalism. You don't need any foreign ideas. You don't need socialism to say this, but Thomas Jefferson himself was quoted favorably by Franklin Roosevelt and explaining this, that very much that you can be a good and patriotic American, liberal, and believe that Americans have two sets of rights of personal competency and property rights, and that the acquisition of too much property is of social harm. Now, that would make you a patriotic, good American liberal. But if you are somebody who says that private property, the goal of even a peaceful goal is to argue that people do not have property rights, that property does not exist, and that you are going to use the American system of government in order to make sure that we stop believing in the fiction that individual human beings can own property, then you are outside of the American political tradition. Does that help? You're not arguing what Thomas Jefferson argued.
Yeah. So, but is that what you are those beliefs what you apply to what you understand progressivism to be arguing?
No,
I
thought you were asking me about social democracy.
Well, so
Yeah.
I used I'm referring both, because you used the term last week or at this recorded session that I looked at on a recording, but you referred both to progressivism and to democratic socialism as examples of extremism.
Okay.
And I think there are, and I'm just trying to figure out, because I think there would be people who would argue, no, that's not what I mean by democratic socialism, or that's not what I mean by progressivism. So I'm trying to understand your working definition.
So first of all, is my description of the difference between how liberals would treat property rights and how somebody on the left would treat property rights, is that sufficient before I move to progressivism?
With the only nuance, Professor, that you seem to have an academic definition of this, because I think that the layman citizen, political activist, me, we use left and right and progressive and liberal and even communist. You know, we say, oh, you're a socialist, you're even a communist. You know, we use it in vernacular much differently than you seem to be using as a professor or academic.
Yeah, I get that, but
Okay.
I don't. Sorry, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what to tell you. Like, I mean, to me, I mean, I studied this stuff, and these distinctions are important because to me, it's the difference between someone who is a patriotic American and someone who wants to destroy America. And I think that's an important distinction to make. You know, like one of these people is advocating for something that is well within the American tradition and belongs as part of the discussion. And yeah, that's a reasonable point to make. And we can argue about whether this is a good idea, but it won't destroy America over the long term versus an idea that just destroys America. You know, so I don't call people leftists unless they deserve it. You know, unless they really insist upon it, and you know, they kind of know what they mean by it. But my issue with progressivism is different than my issue with democratic socialism. To me, they represent a very different danger. So I just want to make sure before we move on to progressivism that I don't know, everybody's satisfied with the distinction I'm trying to make.
Bill?
I think, I mean, I understand your perspective better than I understand the terms. You know, I don't know what democratic socialism means, honestly.
Well, I mean, I always refer to, like, just go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. You know, like you know, if I always say, if you don't believe me, just, you know, believe Marx, or you know, believe Thomas Jefferson. You know, or believe Gramsci or whoever else you want to, because or Lenin, or you know, because these distinctions were really important to them at the time. I mean, the Trotskyites are still fighting today. But the distinction is that if you are somebody who is a liberal, you still believe in everything that's in the Declaration of Independence. You just are somebody who also believes that 51 out of 100 times that you should favor what the majority wants to do. And if you are someone who is a conservative, you want to emphasize the rights of the minority 51 out of 100 times. But that doesn't mean that you reject or believe. I mean, if you're somebody who favors individual liberty over the will of the majority, that doesn't mean you don't think that the majority has no role to play in American politics. You just think that in general, most of the time, it's more important to protect the rights of unpopular minorities than it is to enact the will of the majority. But you still believe that the majority will has a role to play in governing. Yeah. You know, it's not I mean, that's kind of the glories of pluralism, is that you have to actually hold all of these beliefs and balance them in different proportions.
So sorry to interrupt, Bill. So Professor, I'm astounded at my own, you know, it's not that I'm not educated. I have a political science degree and 4 years, and then law school, you know, in addition. And so you were very academic for a moment, and then you took it down to layman's terms, where if you're an American, you're a moderate, you're a centrist, if you're an extremist, you're an extremist. By definition, you're out there, you're crazy out there somewhere. If you're an American, do your thing, man. Sorry to be so blunt, layman.
No,
but
it's true. I mean, but if you're an extremist, I want you to think of it this way. Like, let's say that if you believe in pluralism, you've got these 10 beliefs, right? That and if you're an extremist, you're one of those people who believes that one of those things can be reduced down to 0, and that one of those things can be, or one of those rights can be 100, and everything else is 0. Like, if anybody else is an American, I mean, you can. That's why I would say, like, I don't know if any politician, I'd have to sit down and talk to them to find out if they really believed that there's no such thing as property rights. I would need to drill down with that person, and say, because I know that Elizabeth Warren has said things like that, but I've never heard anybody put it to her in a 1-hour interview on that specific question, to my satisfaction. So, I mean, we have hints, but like I said, most people never, they never reconcile their political beliefs or put them to the test.
Well, so now let me put you on the spot once again, and go ahead and punt on this one, because I actually don't want this on the interweb. So if you wish to punt, please punt, Professor. Is Hillary Clinton an extremist?
I don't think so.
Is Donald Trump an extremist?
Yes.
Well, I'm sorry to put you on there. Now you're going to have all my mom's number 3, I think, after you forever. So sorry about that. Okay. Do you want to explain on that, or are you just comfortable with me asking it in that way?
Well,
I mean, he may become the president of the United States again, Professor, and you just claimed him to be an extremist.
I would just say that the rejection, his position on how to reconcile voting irregularities was to throw away votes of some Americans. Therefore, his position was that some people should not be allowed to vote who should be allowed to vote. And even if you reject everything else that he said, that one thing means that he wants certain people to not vote. He has rejected representative government.
What you're talking about is if you have concerns about the election, this is settled law. If you have concerns about the election and whether a vote, the result or the remedy is to let that person vote again, right, not to discount their vote.
Exactly. That's my point. Like, you don't need to know anything else. If for some reason you think that the legal remedy should be to throw out their vote, then you're an extremist. You are somebody who is saying that someone who legally had the right to vote shouldn't be allowed to vote. You're an extremist. There you go. Like, I don't know.
Okay.
I
have a question.
Know anything else?
Cool. Jump in, Frank.
So I thought the definition of an extremist is someone who advocated the use of force or violence to overthrow the fundamental underpinnings of the American way, American system. So presumably he's an extremist because he did not speak out loudly enough opposing the use of force or violence in the election issue, presumably the January 6th issue. Is that too?
So, I mean, I would say you have married an extremist belief, the belief that votes that should have counted should have been thrown out, with the tacit approval of violence. I would say you're either you're an extremist, but you're either a heart attack or you're a cancer, but if you reject the idea that my definition of extremism and violent extremism is when somebody wants to do this now and advocates the use of violence in doing it. But I would also say that, like, anyone who wants to reduce any of these pluralistic values down to 0 falls within my definition of extremism. Like, that's why I guess, the Democratic Socialist and Donald Trump minus the violence would both be holding extremist beliefs. So I'm saying, even if he had never advocated violence, to advocate that people's votes should be thrown away and would mark him as an extremist.
Okay, that's fair. So I want to go back a couple of thoughts. You had suggested that conservatives would be 51% of the time would tend to weigh in on the side of the unpopular minority. I know the Republican Party historically was the party that was opposing slavery. Go back to slavery, Black Lives Matter, importance of what might be some people would consider an unpopular minority of the Black people in America. How has the Republican Party, the conservative party, been so negatively labeled as being the party that does not support the rights of an unpopular minority, people of color?
Well, first of all, I guess the most unpopular minority is always property owners. So when I say that you are advocating for the rights of an unpopular minority, I know that the word minority tends to bring up issues of race, but that would also include somebody who owns property, or an unpopular religious belief, you name it, right? And I didn't say 51% of the time, I said 51 out of 100 times, which is because I want to make sure that it's,
okay.
I'm being precise in my glib analogy, because I want to make sure people understand that 49 out of 100 times you might find the other way. Yeah. So I mean, this is, and sometimes when you flip a coin, it could come up heads 49 times. So I just want to make sure I inject enough randomness into this. And then, but the second part of your question is a good one, which is, what happened to conservatives? And the answer is that conservatism in and of itself is never going to be popular. I mean, any ideology is not going to be popular because the holding of an ideology is always going to be a minority proposition. I mean, most people don't think about politics that much. So having a political belief system that requires more than 3 sentences to explain is always going to be a minority proposition. So the advancement of every political ideal involves, yes, people who hold these political ideals, but then getting regular people to vote for you. And I would say one of the things that happened really over the course of the 1990s was that's when Southern populists became a permanent part of the Republican governing majority and tried to fuse ideals that are actually the opposite of the Republican Party into the Republican Party. But this is what they really had in common. And for many years, I used the term populist anti-liberals to describe these people because they weren't Republicans. They were populist anti-liberals who didn't like Bill Clinton. And so, but they voted Republican and then somehow became convinced that they were Republicans. But really that would imply that they actually embraced the ideals of the Republican Party, which they never did. They were just sort of populist anti-liberals.
Frank, remember your thought. So, Professor, has that morphed into potentially where today's Republican Party has a slight majority or even vast majority of the rank and file Republicans that aren't truly Republicans?
Yes. I mean, I think especially in a lot of states where I mean, you have to hesitate. I mean, the elections that took place this week indicate that maybe there is room for Republicans to take over the Republican Party again. And the way to do that is by simply emphasizing the old values of the Republican Party and trying not to mention Donald Trump's name, because many of the ideals and ideas of that are now held within the Democratic Party are just as extreme.
And so, Professor, we may, just as a brief interlude, and then go ahead back to you, Frank, as a brief interlude, there's no doubt that education policy and cultural norms of thoughts of who's more important, the individual, the family, the community, the school board, played a huge part in that. And we haven't flushed that out enough, kind of the history of education in America. So either next week or in future weeks, will you ponder that as a brief interlude? Because I think it's very timely that there's clearly a sea change that's happened all within a year, which is just amazing. Americans are so fascinating. Frank, keep going.
So is there precedent? Is it possible that reminding Republicans, conservatives, that the fundamentals of their ideals require that they that we generally move to support the rights of the unpopular minority, and in doing so, by pointing that out routinely and consistently, do we regain the ability to own that and be recognized in society as the party that is most likely going to, the odds are in favor to protect the rights of unpopular minorities?
I don't know about Republicans, but conservatives, bravo, Frank, thank you. Professor, I didn't mean to interject.
Yeah, I mean, I guess hope springs eternal. The problem is that many people would have lost their credibility because of things that they have said and done to undermine those ideals over the past 16 years. So, but the ideals of the old Republican Party were formed out of what were the things that the vast majority of Americans already believed in the face of the extremist challenge. And so if you think about those ideals, as long as we have some sort of political culture that remains familiar to Americans, you should be able to have politicians who can explain to the American people what Abraham Lincoln said, which is, there is one thing that entwines itself about the human heart, and that principle is liberty to all. That's what gives enterprise and industry and hope to all. And what we should hope for people is that we should want equality of opportunity for all Americans. And if you have the right politician who can put that into a narrative that people can understand, then of course they can reset the course. But as Jason Nelson just said in the chat comments, it's not always a rational exercise because emotions are often involved. But that's why it was such a long-term struggle to, I mean, if you think about it, it's so sad in a way that President Trump was able to come to power when he did, because conservatives were right on the cusp of so many victories. I mean, realigning the legal system of the United States was a really long and complicated and difficult set of circumstances. I mean, the idea that there are people in the United States who now believe in that the words mean what they say, you know, call it either conservatism or textualism or originalism. There are a lot of different
Strict constructionalism, yeah.
Yeah, strict constructionist, you name it, right? But the idea that that would that a large portion of the legal profession would now embrace one of those various conservative philosophies is remarkable. That took 50 years. I mean, if you went back and looked at the legal profession in 1950, you know, the living Constitution, the progressive Constitution was everybody. I mean, so, you know, it's kind of sad. And at the same time, I was thinking about this other thing that Lincoln said about that extremism can grow. I'm going to mess this up, but that, like, basically out of prosperity, you'll sometimes embrace extremism and forget to advocate for rights. And that's also one of the other dangers. Is it's not always, you know, we face these temptations when times are bad because we're looking for solutions, but we also face these temptations when times are good. You're not hungry.
We're running out of time, you all, and I'm not sure I've done justice to Bill or Frank. So to my apologies to both of you. But I do want to do just a quick lightning round with the other four folks on the call. You don't have to ask a question, but it's got to be, if you want to, it's got to be concise. And Professor, you should answer it concisely as well.
Can I
Doctor,
go
ahead.
Remember the second part of Bill's question that I never got around to answering, which is my problem with progressivism, which I think you can probably hear from my answer about the legal tradition. My problem with progressivism was the living Constitution doctrine, the idea that each generation can simply rewrite the Constitution the way they want was my major problem with
well, and a slight nuance to that, Professor. As a conservative, if you want to rewrite the Constitution, there's a means to it. Make a constitutional amendment.
Sure. And then the other thing that is, I guess, often overlooked within the progressive tradition, certainly within some elements of the progressive tradition, was its advocacy of racism, the application of what was either science or social science to determine the course of the government rather than political values. You know, I mean, this is maybe something for another day, but the idea that somehow we should use social science data and today's social science data in order to tell the federal government what they should be doing is also pretty destructive to the long-term success of the American experiment.
Several hints on why we might need to do a third show on extremism and the history of extremism. With your permission, Professor, I want to at least give a bite at the apple for Anthony, Dr. Force, Bart Miller, and Jason. Dr. Force, you have yourself off mics, and Frank, if you can close yours. Dr. Force, did you have a quick question?
No, I have an observation. It's more or less definition. It's whose definition are you working with, and whose definition is being used to describe something. And I would like to make also a clarification of Catholicism, and because I'm from the Jesuit perspective of Catholicism, and it's a different kind of perspective than it is from a church perspective. So those are my only two things.
Quick reaction to that, because we've done a whole show on semantics and the definitions of words and do words have meaning, but it's a legitimate point, because I think it's what Bill has alluded to and several of our friends that that really got their umbrage up over part of our conversation last week. So I think it's worthy of pursuit. Professor, quick reaction.
No, you're right. That's why I try to be, try to have a lot of conversations about what words mean. And then the second thing is this: I would never argue that this tiny minority position of a handful of, pro-Trump intellectuals who were grasping at straws for a way to justify his election in any way represents anything other than the tiniest sliver of minority belief among Catholics. Like this is a few hundred people. Like it's not even a significant movement within the Catholic Church. So I would never. I hope that was clear from my discussion.
Cool. Thanks for your comment and your brevity and answer, Professor. Bart, you took yourself off mute, and then Jason and Anthony, you'll have a quick bite at the apple. Bart.
Okay, this is just a real quick observation, Professor. I think one of the hard things with trying to talk about extremism and people who are not extremists as part of the same conversation is that it's really hard to generalize, because I think that at various times people can be extremists who really are not extremists. They're not going to cause real problems, but yet on any given issue, they might feel, oh, I've got to go out and put up a weird sign in a place that it doesn't belong, which might make them be considered extremists, and it's just a weird, it's a hard thing. And I think you've done a very good job at discussing it.
Thank you. I would, you just reminded me of something my friend Tom used to say, the military historian who we interviewed, Tom Brasino.
That's Professor Brasino, yeah. Professor
Brasino, sorry, who's also a good Catholic. And my godson hopefully got his birthday present. It's supposed to be arriving tomorrow. But he said, and he's great at this. He's very pithy in this way, but he said, if I want to know if somebody is patriotic, I ask them. And if it takes more than 3 seconds for them to answer, the answer is no. So ask somebody if they're an extremist, and if it takes more than 3 seconds for them to answer, the answer is yes.
That's what we expected from a professor from the military
right.
Command and War College. Yeah, that's actually cool. Bart, did that satisfy your comment? And okay. Tony and Jason, you don't have to, but we're already at 12:04. Quick question, comment, advocation. No, you're good, Tony. Jason, you good?
Frank, Bill.
Looks like he's good. Any last calls from anyone? All right, Professor, thank you for your conversation today. I hope we're going to get a critique. I'm telling you, I've got a friend who's going to take every single sentence we've said. And so for that critique, I want to remind everyone that this isn't gotcha politics. This isn't something where I'm trying to make Professor look bad by saying he likes Hillary. He didn't say that. Or he thinks Trump's a traitor. He didn't say that. It's to understand issues in historical context and to think through how we become better citizens in America. So somebody might take it out of context and think, John's a jerk and so is the professor. That's not our intent. Our intent is to have conversation. Reaction to that, Professor?
Yeah, and I would just say that, like, one of the other things is I try to model how a historian is supposed to be, which is like, I'm supposed to be summarizing evidence that's in front of me. Like, if somebody put evidence in front of me that Hillary Clinton was an extremist, then I would conclude that she was. Like, but you're asking me from my memory, can I remember in this moment? And so to me, when you're even asking me that question, what I'm hearing is, do I have evidence in my brain right now that I can recall that says Hillary Clinton is an extremist? And so if I don't have that evidence, my answer has to be no. Does that make sense? Like, I'm not saying I know everything. I'm saying I have to say no because I don't have this evidence in front of me. Does that make sense?
Well, and I think it's the virtue of the show of interviewing a historian and a different way to look at things versus we all just have an opinion. I'm mad and I'm going to voice it out on the interweb.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, what I'm usually thinking is, do I have evidence for what I'm about to say? You know, can I think of what the 5 footnotes would be that would justify my next answer? You know, it's also why I give long, weird, convoluted answers. You know, that are often unsatisfying.
yeah, cool. Last call for anyone.
Well
Professor,
done.
you're good.
Great.
All right. Thank you for the conversation. Let's disconnect for today. And